The last person Ethan Walker expected to see at his son's high school graduation was the wife he had buried 15 years earlier. He stood near the back of the crowded auditorium at Pittsburgh Central High, still wearing the Navy uniform pants from his overnight paramedic shift, while hundreds of parents raised their phones as the graduating class filed toward the stage. Ethan should have been watching Caleb. Instead, his attention locked onto a woman standing beside the far exit beneath a glowing red sign. Her hair was shorter and touched with gray, and time had softened the face Ethan remembered, but he knew the slight tilt of her head, the way she pressed her thumb against her wedding finger when nervous, and the faint scar above her left eyebrow. Laura. A knot tightened in his chest so suddenly that he gripped the seat in front of him. 15 years earlier, state troopers had told him Laura's car had burned after leaving a mountain road in West Virginia. Charles Bennett, an executive at St. Matthew's Medical Center and a longtime family acquaintance, had identified her through dental records. The casket had remained closed. Ethan had buried it anyway, then raised 6-month-old Caleb alone while speaking to a grave that contained everything except the woman he loved. On stage, Caleb's name echoed through the auditorium. Ethan forced himself to look forward long enough to see his son accept his diploma. When he turned back, Laura was still there, but now Ethan noticed the teenage girl beside her. She looked about 17, with dark hair, a narrow face, and gray eyes so familiar that Ethan felt the room tilt. They were his eyes. The girl leaned close and said something that made Laura smile, and the expression struck Ethan like a memory brought back to life. Without thinking, he pushed into the aisle. Parents protested as he moved past them, but their voices blurred beneath the pounding in his ears. Laura saw him when he was 20 feet away. Her smile vanished. The color drained from her face. "Laura," Ethan called. The girl turned first. Laura seized her hand and hurried toward the exit. Ethan followed them into the hallway, where sunlight streamed through tall windows and graduates crowded around their families. "Laura, stop." She did not. Ethan reached the front steps just as she guided the girl into a dark SUV. For 1 second before the door closed, the teenager looked directly at him. The resemblance was undeniable. The SUV pulled away from the curb, leaving Ethan frozen among cheering families and drifting graduation balloons. Caleb appeared behind him, diploma in hand. "Dad, who were you chasing?" Ethan stared down the street, unable to answer. Then, at the intersection, the SUV stopped at a red light. Laura turned in the passenger seat and looked back through the rear window. Ethan expected guilt or grief. What he saw instead was fear. The fear of someone who had spent 15 years knowing this moment might come. The photograph Ethan almost did not take became the first proof that his life had been built around a lie. That night, after Caleb fell asleep following a quiet graduation dinner, Ethan sat alone at the kitchen table and enlarged every picture from the auditorium. Most were blurred by movement, but one showed Laura near the exit with the teenage girl beside her. Ethan cropped the image until only their faces remained. Laura looked older, but unmistakable. The girl looked as though someone had combined Laura's mouth with Ethan's eyes. He searched the school's public graduation program and found her name beneath a scholarship announcement. Sophie Bennett, 17 years old, accepted into a pre-med summer program. Listed as the daughter of Laura Bennett and Diane Bennett in an old community newsletter. Ethan stared at the screen. Diane Bennett was Charles's older sister. The connection made his skin turn cold. He searched public records until dawn. Sophie's birth date appeared in a youth volunteer profile. She had been born 8 months after Laura's reported death. Ethan checked the date 3 times, hoping exhaustion had distorted the numbers. It had not. Caleb entered the kitchen shortly after sunrise and found his father surrounded by printed records. "You never answered me," he said. "Who was that woman?" Ethan closed the laptop too quickly. Caleb's expression changed. He had inherited Laura's ability to recognize a lie before it was spoken. "Dad, what's going on?" Ethan wanted to tell him everything, but all he possessed were a photograph and impossible dates. "I saw someone who reminded me of your mom," he said. Caleb went still. "Reminded you of her? Or was her?" Ethan could not meet his eyes. Caleb picked up the graduation photograph before Ethan could stop him. He studied Laura, then Sophie. "That girl looks like you." The words settled heavily between them. Ethan took the picture back and promised he would explain when he understood more. Caleb left without arguing, which frightened Ethan more than anger would have. Later that morning, Ethan contacted Detective Rachel Monroe, an investigator he knew through emergency calls. Before she agreed to help, she warned him that grief could make people see patterns that were not there. Ethan sent the photograph and the dates. 10 minutes later, Rachel called back. "Do you still have Laura's death certificate?" Ethan retrieved it from a lockbox in his bedroom, along with the few personal items returned after the crash. Beneath an old sympathy card, he found a photograph from their first wedding anniversary. Laura wore a silver bracelet with a small compass charm. Ethan remembered the promise engraved on the back. "Wherever life takes us, find your way home." His breath stopped. In the graduation photograph, Sophie wore the same bracelet. Not a similar one. The same compass, the same bent clasp Ethan had repaired years earlier. Someone had passed Laura's most private possession to Sophie, and only Laura could have told her what it meant. Ethan could not stop staring at the bracelet, and the deeper he looked into Laura's death, the clearer it became that someone had carefully designed it to survive every question he had been too broken to ask. At 8 the next morning, he met Detective Rachel Monroe at a coffee shop near the Allegheny County Courthouse and placed Laura's death certificate, Sophie's photograph, and the image of the compass bracelet on the table. Rachel examined the documents in silence. "You never saw Laura's body?" she finally asked. Ethan shook his head. "They said the fire made identification impossible." "Who confirmed it?" "Charles Bennett." Charles's name appeared twice in the file, once as the family representative and again beside a hospital identification statement signed by Dr. Aaron Wells. The medical examiner's report referred to dental records, but did not identify the dentist who supplied them. Rachel called that unusual, though not yet proof of fraud. By noon, she had obtained access to the archive crash report through an official records request connected to a reopened missing person inquiry. Ethan drove to the cemetery while he waited, stopping beneath the gray stone engraved with Laura's name. Beloved wife and mother. The final word now felt unbearable. Had she already known she was carrying Sophie when Ethan stood there holding 6-month-old Caleb? Had she watched from somewhere nearby as he buried an empty casket? Rachel called as Ethan stood before the grave. The dental chart attached to Laura's file had been uploaded 3 days after the death certificate was signed. The original digital record had later been replaced during a hospital database migration. The replacement came from St. Matthew's Medical Center, where Charles had served as chief financial officer. Worse, the vehicle identification number in the crash report did not match Laura's insurance policy. 5 digits were different. Ethan drove directly to Rachel's office. On her desk were photographs recovered from the evidence archive. The burned vehicle resembled Laura's sedan, but a faded dealership decal on the rear bumper came from West Virginia. Laura had purchased her car in Pittsburgh. Then whose car burned? Ethan asked. Rachel opened a second file, recovered from a gas station 11 miles from the mountain road. The security video was damaged and silent, but its timestamp read 8:42 p.m., nearly 3 hours before the crash. A dark sedan stopped beside Pump 6. A woman wearing Laura's tan raincoat stepped out, removed a duffel bag from the trunk, and entered an SUV that had pulled alongside her. Even through the grainy footage, Ethan recognized the way she tucked her hair behind her left ear. Rachel froze the final frame. A hospital parking permit was visible inside the SUV's windshield. The letters SMMC were printed across it. St. Matthew's Medical Center. Laura turned toward the camera before the vehicle pulled away. Her face was pale, and one hand rested protectively across her stomach. A man sat behind the wheel. Only part of his profile was visible, but the heavy silver watch on his wrist was unmistakable. Charles Bennett had worn that same watch while standing beside Ethan at Laura's funeral. Some reunions do not heal old wounds. They reveal how carefully those wounds were kept open. Rachel traced a current employment record connected to Diane Bennett and found a senior living center on the quiet outskirts of Pittsburgh. Ethan arrived shortly after for the next afternoon, telling himself he wanted answers, not revenge. He saw Laura before she saw him. She was adjusting a blanket around an elderly woman's shoulders, then kneeling to tie the woman's shoe. Time had changed her, but not the gentleness Ethan remembered. For one impossible second, she was simply his wife again. Then Laura looked up. Her smile disappeared, and the color left her face. She handed the wheelchair to another caregiver and led Ethan toward a small courtyard enclosed by rose bushes. "You should not have come," she whispered. Ethan stared at her. "I buried you." Laura closed her eyes. "I know. Caleb grew up believing his mother was dead. I know. I spent 15 years talking to a gravestone." She could not answer. Ethan placed the silver compass bracelet on a stone bench. Laura's breath caught, and her hand moved toward it before stopping. "You kept it." "No," Ethan said. "She did." Laura understood immediately. "Sophie." Ethan stepped closer. "She's my daughter, isn't she?" Laura looked toward the garden, where families visited relatives and children laughed beyond the hedges. Ordinary life continued while Ethan waited for the answer that would divide everything into before and after. Laura nodded once. Ethan staggered backward. 17 years of missed birthdays, first steps, school plays, and Christmas mornings hit him all at once. "How could you let me believe both of you were gone?" Laura pressed her trembling hands together. "Because I believed disappearing was the only way to keep you and Caleb alive." Anger broke through Ethan's shock. "Do not give me one sentence for 15 years. Tears rolled down Laura's face. "I'm not trying to explain 15 years. I'm trying to explain one night that destroyed all of them." Footsteps sounded behind them. Sophie entered the courtyard carrying a canvas bag filled with library books. She stopped when she saw Ethan. Her eyes moved between him and Laura. "Mom!" Laura's fear returned. "Sophie, please." Sophie noticed the bracelet on the bench. "Where did he get that?" Ethan answered before Laura could. "I gave it to your mother on our first wedding anniversary." The courtyard went silent. Sophie looked at Laura, then at Ethan's gray eyes, which matched her own. "Why did you run from him at graduation?" Laura opened her mouth, but no words came. Ethan kept his voice gentle. "My name is Ethan Walker. I was married to your mother." "Was?" Sophie asked. Laura finally forced the truth into the open. "Ethan is your biological father." Sophie went completely still. Then she whispered the question Laura had feared for nearly 18 years. "You told me my father abandoned us. Was that a lie too?" Sophie's question left Ethan facing a truth more frightening than any deception. He could prove he was her father, but he could not make her want him in her life. Laura admitted she had lied about Sophie's father abandoning them. Ethan immediately told Sophie he had never known she existed. The answer seemed to hurt her more than anger would have. She stepped away from both of them and asked whether they could prove what they were saying. 3 days later, Ethan sat across from her in a private testing clinic while a nurse sealed 2 DNA samples into separate envelopes. Laura waited in the parking lot because Sophie refused to let her inside. The silence between Ethan and the girl felt painfully delicate. He noticed she bounced her right knee when anxious, exactly as he did. Sophie caught him watching and stopped. "Do you have other children?" she asked. "A son. Caleb. He's 18. Does he know about me?" "Not yet." Disappointment crossed her face. "So I'm a secret again." Ethan leaned forward. "No, you're a truth I am trying to carry without letting more people get hurt." While they waited for the results, Sophie agreed to meet Ethan twice in public places she chose. At a coffee shop, they discovered they both disliked cinnamon and hot chocolate. At a city park, Ethan learned she wanted to become a doctor after years of volunteering with elderly residents. Sophie learned Ethan had worked hundreds of overnight emergency calls and still attended every school concert, parent meeting, and game Caleb asked him to attend. Their conversations remained cautious, but small similarities kept appearing. The same dry humor, the same habit of reading the last page of a book first, and the same instinct to help strangers before themselves. Ethan eventually told Caleb everything. His son stared at Sophie's photograph for a long time. "So Mom was alive," Caleb said, "and she raised another child while you raised me alone." "We still do not know the whole story," Ethan replied. Caleb pushed the picture away. You keep saying we. Since when are you and her a we? Ethan heard fear beneath the anger, but could not find words strong enough to reassure him. The clinic uploaded the DNA results before he could try again. Ethan opened a report with Caleb across the kitchen table and Sophie waiting through a video call. The test confirmed a 99.99% probability of biological paternity. Sophie covered her mouth as tears gathered in her eyes. Ethan felt 17 missing years collapse into one silent moment. I don't know what to call you, Sophie whispered. Ethan is fine, he said. You decide everything else when you are ready. She nodded, crying now, but she did not end the call. Caleb looked at her on the screen, then at his father. Congratulations, he said quietly. You found the daughter you never knew you had. He turned toward the stairs. I just hope you don't forget the son who has been here the whole time. The worst part of Laura's confession was not that Charles had forced her to disappear. It was that years later, when she finally could have returned, she chose not to. Ethan found her the next evening in the empty chapel of the senior living center, sitting beneath a stained glass window while rain tapped against the roof. He had spent the day trying to reassure Caleb, answer Sophie's careful messages, and understand how one DNA result had divided his life into two separate versions of fatherhood. No more half-truths, he said after closing the chapel door. Laura looked up, her eyes swollen from crying. Ethan remained standing. Start with Charles. 15 years earlier, while working in the billing department at St. Matthew's Medical Center, Laura had discovered that Charles Bennett was stealing from a patient assistance fund through false insurance claims, duplicate death certificates, and accounts created under the names of isolated patients. She copied altered records onto a flash drive and planned to contact federal investigators. Charles learned what she had done. He showed her fabricated access logs and reimbursement forms bearing Ethan's paramedic identification. Because Ethan occasionally picked Laura up after late shifts and used his badge to enter restricted areas, Charles had enough real information to create a convincing false trail. He said he would go to prison, Laura whispered. He said Caleb would lose both of us. Charles arranged the abandoned vehicle, false dental records, and a new identity. Diane took Laura out of state, while Charles promised the evidence against Ethan would disappear if Laura never contacted him. Laura had been about 7 weeks pregnant when she disappeared, and 7 months later, Sophie was born. For years, Laura moved between small towns and believed Charles was still watching. Then Ethan asked the question she had avoided. When did you realize you could come home? Laura stared at the floor. 7 years ago. Ethan stepped back. Charles had lost his hospital position after a quiet internal review, and his influence had weakened. Diane urged Laura to contact Ethan. Laura even drove to Pittsburgh once and parked across from his house. She watched Ethan help Caleb recover after falling from his bicycle. You looked happy, she said. You had built a life without me. Ethan's voice hardened. That was never your decision to make. Laura admitted she feared Ethan would hate her and Sophie would lose the only stable life she knew. You let Caleb believe his mother was dead, Ethan said. You let Sophie believe her father abandoned her. Charles chose for you that first night. Every year after you were free enough to return was your choice. Laura did not defend herself. She admitted she had written Ethan dozens of letters, but never mailed them. Each year made returning harder, and every missed birthday became another reason to remain hidden. As Ethan turned toward the door, Laura removed an old bank statement from her purse. The account was in Laura Walker's name and had remained active for 15 years. Large transfers still passed through it, including one 6 weeks earlier. I never opened this account, she said. Ethan studied the routing information connected to St. Matthew's. Charles had not only used Laura's death to silence her. He was still using the identity of a dead woman to move money, and every forged document had been designed to lead investigators directly to Ethan. The account that belonged to a woman legally dead for 15 years was still helping someone alive steal millions. Within hours of receiving Laura's bank statement, Detective Rachel Monroe obtained authorization for financial investigators to examine the account. The next morning, a conference room inside the district attorney's office was covered with bank transfers, insurance claims, hospital payroll records, and property documents extending nearly 2 decades. Every payment made under Laura Walker's name eventually passed through shell companies connected to Charles Bennett. The money came from dormant patient trusts, unclaimed insurance reimbursements, and charitable grants meant for families facing devastating medical bills. Rachel placed the records across an evidence board. This was not one crime, she said. It was an operating system. A recent series of transfers led to emergency medical transportation vendors, including the ambulance contractor where Ethan had worked during his first 5 years as a paramedic. His employee number appeared in archived authorization logs, and copies of his electronic signature appeared on reimbursement forms. Charles had constructed the evidence so that, if the fraud were exposed, Ethan would appear to be the insider who helped Laura steal the money and stage her death. Rachel's phone rang before she could explain further. Diane Bennett wanted to speak. That afternoon, Ethan and Rachel drove to Diane's modest brick townhouse outside Pittsburgh. Her hair had turned completely gray, and exhaustion seemed carved into her face. Before Rachel asked a question, Diane placed a locked wooden box on the dining table. Inside were dozens of sealed envelopes addressed to Ethan. None had been mailed. The oldest letter had been written 3 weeks after Sophie's birth. Laura described the baby's tiny hands and how she imagined Ethan holding her. Other letters marked Sophie's first day of school, a spelling bee, a broken wrist, and birthdays Ethan never knew were happening. Laura had written to him as though he still belonged in their lives, then folded each memory away. Diane admitted she had begged Laura to return many times. She also revealed that Charles visited every few months to collect financial documents signed under Laura's assumed identity. Diane originally believed the paperwork protected Laura's cover, but one afternoon she saw account balances worth millions. When she confronted Charles, he warned that Ethan would be arrested first if she ever spoke. Rachel photographed the letters and sealed them as evidence. Then Diane removed a final envelope from beneath the table. It had never been opened. On the front, Laura had written, "If anything happens to me again." Inside was a single page explaining that Charles kept one original insurance file in a place investigators would never search. Only one other person knew where it was. At the bottom was a name Ethan had seen in the hospital identification statement, but had not heard spoken since the night Laura supposedly died, Dr. Aaron Wells. By the time Ethan learned Charles had formally accused him, police were already approaching his house with a search warrant. Red and blue lights moved across the living room walls shortly after dawn as Rachel stepped onto the porch with 2 officers. She did not arrest Ethan, but the regret in her expression told him how dangerous the situation had become. Overnight, Charles had delivered a package to prosecutors containing fraudulent ambulance invoices, hospital access logs, and transfer approvals bearing Ethan's employee number and copied signature. The documents created a complete false narrative. Ethan had helped Laura steal money, stage her death, and profited from the scheme for 15 years. "I believe these records were manufactured," Rachel said as officers collected Ethan's old employment files and laptop. "But belief is not enough. We need the originals." Caleb stood near the stairs, pale with anger. "This started when she came back," he said. Before Ethan could respond, Laura arrived with Sophie. Caleb's face hardened. "You should leave." Sophie flinched. Laura did not. She turned to Rachel. "I want to make a full statement. Every name I used, every document Charles forced me to sign, and every year I stayed silent after I could have returned. I will testify in court, and I will accept the consequences." Rachel warned that Laura could face charges for identity fraud, obstruction, and filing false records. Laura answered, "Then write it all down." For 6 hours, she described the night Charles took her from the gas station, the false death record, the financial documents signed under threat, and the choices she later made out of fear and shame. She did not excuse herself or request immunity. Prosecutors agreed to postpone action against Ethan while Rachel searched for Aaron Wells. They found a retired physician in a small town nearly 90 miles north of Pittsburgh. He initially refused to speak, but Laura's name broke his silence. Aaron arrived at the district attorney's office the next morning carrying a weathered metal case. Inside were the original emergency intake record from the night Laura supposedly died. No woman matching Laura had ever entered St. Matthew's. The dental chart used to identify the burned remains belonged to an unidentified patient who had died months earlier. Handwritten notes showed Charles directing staff to connect the false records to Ethan's paramedic credentials. Aaron admitted he had lied when Charles ordered the records destroyed, but secretly kept them because he could not erase the truth completely. A final folder contained the original access logs. Ethan's identification number had been manually entered from an administrator's terminal at the exact time Ethan was documented responding to an emergency 12 miles away. Then Aaron removed a sealed insurance file from beneath the case lining. Charles's signature appeared on every authorization, including a handwritten instruction. Contingency plan. Ethan Walker accepts full responsibility. Rachel's phone rang as she examined it. Federal agents had learned Charles was heading toward Pittsburgh International Airport under an alias. Rachel grabbed the file and hurried toward the door. For the first time in 15 years, Charles was no longer controlling the evidence. He was running from it. Justice could not return the 15 years Ethan had lost, but it finally prevented Charles Bennett from stealing the years that remained. Federal agents stopped Charles at the departure gate before he boarded an international flight under an alias. Rachel delivered Aaron Wells's original records, Laura's sworn statement, Diane's testimony, the hidden letters, and the insurance file bearing Charles's handwritten contingency plan. The investigation exposed millions of dollars taken for vulnerable patients through shell companies, false death records, fabricated insurance claims, and stolen identities. Laura's supposed death had become the foundation of the scheme, while Ethan had been positioned as the scapegoat if anyone discovered it. This time, however, every altered record led back to Charles. Months later, Ethan sat inside a quiet courtroom as Charles accepted a federal plea agreement that included a lengthy prison sentence, restitution, and the forfeiture of assets connected to the fraud. When their eyes met, Ethan expected relief or satisfaction. Instead, he felt tired. Hatred had already taken too much from him, and he refused to let it take anything else. Aaron publicly admitted his silence and surrendered his medical license. Laura also appeared before the court. Because she had confessed voluntarily, cooperated fully, and provided evidence essential to dismantling the scheme, she received probation, community service, and financial monitoring rather than prison. The judge told her that fear could explain a decision, but could not erase its consequences. Laura accepted the ruling without argument. Healing did not begin with a dramatic embrace. It began in small, imperfect moments. Caleb kept his distance from Laura for months, but he slowly allowed Sophie into his life. Their first genuine conversation occurred while assembling a bookshelf for her apartment. They argued over missing screws, laughed when the shelf collapsed, and ordered pizza after abandoning the instructions. Somewhere between frustration and laughter, they stopped feeling like strangers. Sophie visited Ethan most Sunday afternoons. Sometimes they cooked. Sometimes they walked through the neighborhood where she might have grown up. Their relationship contained difficult questions, awkward silences, and grief for memories they could never create, but also developed ordinary moments they refused to waste. Ethan attended one of Sophie's medical volunteer presentations and applauded louder than anyone. When she found him in the audience, she smiled without uncertainty and quietly introduced him to a classmate as her dad. Nearly a year after the graduation reunion, Ethan returned to the cemetery where Laura's false gravestone still stood beneath an old oak tree. With the legal case resolved, the empty burial marker could finally be removed. Laura joined him, carrying the silver compass bracelet in one hand. Together, they replaced the false monument with a simple memorial stone honoring the unidentified woman whose dental records had been stolen. Caleb and Sophie walked up the hill carrying coffee. Caleb handed a cup to Laura. She accepted it with trembling hands. It was not complete forgiveness, but it was the first kindness he had offered her without being asked. Ethan looked at his son, his daughter, and the woman who had returned from the dead, carrying both truth and regret. His family would never become what it might have been. Too many years had been stolen. Yet something had survived every lie, every fear, and every silence. The courage to begin again. Laura fastened the compass bracelet around Sophie's wrist, and Sophie took Ethan's hand. Those gray eyes no longer reminded him only of everything he had lost. They reminded him of everything he still had. For the first time in 15 years, no one was running, no one was hiding, and every person standing beneath the autumn sky finally knew the way home.